All Ukrainians today are looking with hope at the protest movement in Moscow. Hopefully, because internal problems weaken the aggressor country. And if it comes to an uprising, it will be great. What could be better than an uprising in the hostile state? Especially since the older generation still remember the quote from Pushkin that the Russian uprising being senseless and ruthless in their minds. But time passes, and there is no uprising. What happened? Why do anti-Putin demonstrators not resist security forces? Why do they allow themselves to be detained? And some of them even help the police to push their own police car out of the snow. Just like in Repin's painting, Barge Haulers on the Volga. Where is it, the Russian uprising hyped by the classic? Should we even hope for it? In order to understand this discrepancy, it is worth recalling at the outset why Pushkin wrote his famous phrase. It appeared in the story The Captain's Daughter, which tells the story of the uprising of Yemelyan Pugachev in 1773. That was not so long ago, and there are enough documents about it. After all, Pugachev was interrogated and tried for a long time, and court cases are one of the most reliable sources of information. So, the Pugachev rebellion is a fairly good study. The surviving materials show that it was not the Russian uprising at all. More precisely, it was an uprising, but not the Russian one. Judge for yourself. Yemelyan Pugachev, as you probably know, declared himself Emperor Peter III. And, as expected, as a czar to an emperor, he issued manifestos. Researchers have noted that in his manifestos he addresses the Bashkirs, Kalmyks, Tatars, and Kazakhs, but never the Russians, Muscovites, or what were then called Great Russians. There is simply no reference to them. A logical question arises. What kind of the Russian uprising is it if Russians are not its participants? Let's move on. In the investigation files, we find the following characterization of the rebel leader. The eternal lesser Russian propensity for discontent. That is, translated into modern language, the eternal Ukrainian tendency to protest. Ukrainian. Well, if we add here the investigators note that Pugachev was born in the lesser Russian village of Zimovskaya on the Don, the situation becomes even more interesting. And immediately, Pushkin's Russian uprising begins to look largely like a lesser Russian, that is, Ukrainian. This means that it is of interest to us. And it is worth a closer look. After all, we are on the Taras Shevchenko channel, which was created to highlight dark places and fill in the white spots of Ukrainian history. I am Brother Kapernov, and as always, we meet with you on YouTube. And, these meetings are made possible by noble people who support our work with their contributions through Patreon and on the card. Thank them for that, as we do. And if possible, join this noble community. You will find all the necessary links below the video. Another effective way to support the channel is to order our books. In particular, The Painted History of Ukrainian Independence, which will allow you and your children to quickly understand complex historical stories. That is why our book is very helpful in preparing for the external independent testing. But most importantly, do not forget that our weapon at this moment is a like and a comment. However, let's get back to the senseless and ruthless Russian uprising. Following Pushkin, we started with Pugachev. But if we go beyond Pugachev and look at the issue more broadly, we will quickly find out that the brand Russian uprising itself is nothing more than a fake. Judge for yourself. The famous insurgent wars led by Ivan Bolotnikov began in 1606 where? In Putyvl. In our Ukrainian Putyvl, which at that time was seized by Muscovy along with the Siversk China. And the leader Bolotnikov himself was born and raised in the Chernihiv region. Then he went to the Don, was captured by the Tatars, was a slave in the Golar, escaped to Venice, and later moved to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and from there to Putyvl, where he led the uprising of Ukrainian peasants, which grew into a whole peasant war. Excuse me, but why is this the Russian uprising? 60 years after Bolotnikov, the famous Stenka Razin rebelled. It would seem that there is nothing to complain about here. From over the island to the shore, and she's tossed overboard into the surging waves. In short, the Russian world bundled with the Russian uprising. But if you open Wikipedia, you immediately find out that Razin himself was born and raised in the same village as Pugachev, in the Ukrainian village of Zymoveska on the Don. That is, he was not a Russian. However, Russian historians have an alternative version. They say that Stepan Timofeyevich was born not in the Ukrainian village of Zymoveska, but in Starocherkassk. Therefore, he is a Donian by birth. However, those who say this must not have been interested in the history of Starocherkassk itself. The researcher Volodymyr Bronevsky, for example, wrote that in year 1570 Zaporizhia Cherkasy built a new town 64 kilometers from Azov, naming it Cherkassk after themselves. In fact, this Cherkassk became the first capital of the Don Cossacks, and after the construction of Novocherkassk it became known as Starocherkassk. Thus, it turns out that Stenka Razin is not a Russian, one way or another. And the main force of the uprising was the Cossacks. The Don, Volga, and Ural Cossacks, who at that time had the status of autonomy in Moscow. So, again, this was not the Russian uprising, but rather an anti-Russian one. Then, in 1705, there was the famous uprising of Kondraty Bulevin. Again, we open Wikipedia and what do we see? Kondraty Avsid Bulevin was born in Staryi Saltiv, Kharkiv region, and he started his own uprising while serving as an ataman in Bakhmut. Yes, our Ukrainian Bakhmut. And the uprising, by the way, began when the Muscovites took away the Cossacks' traditional trade of salt mining. So it turns out that this is an anti-Russian uprising, but not a Russian one. For those who wish to continue studying the Russian uprisings, we refer you to Ages and Categories of Rebellion in the Russian Empire. There, you will be surprised to see that the vast majority of these uprisings are, in fact, anti-Russian. Either Ukrainians are rebels, or Aleuts, or Bashkirs, or even Mordovians. The only thing that people who call themselves Great Russians have been able to do is pogroms. Salt, copper, plate pogroms. But we understand the difference between a pogrom and an uprising. An uprising is politics, and a pogrom is economics. So do not hope for the Russian uprising. It has never happened and it will not happen now. Only the peoples they have conquered can uprise. But we can already feel that some commentators are writing, "Why are you talking about this Russia?" The Taras Shevchenko channel specializes in Ukrainian history. This is true. And that's why we looked at the uprisings, which was initiated by Ukrainians. Bolotnikov, Razin, Bulevin, Pugachev. These are the largest and most famous uprisings against the Moscow authorities in history. And since they took place during the period of Muscovy's struggle for Ukrainian lands, they had a direct impact on our history. The most striking example is the destruction of the Sich and the occupation of the lands of the Zaporozhian host in 1775, which was the result of the defeat of Yemelian Pugachev in 1884. In addition, Ukrainians often joined the ranks of uprising in neighboring lands. And so we were quite logically interested in the Don. Because the Don region and the Don Cossacks played a major role in the history of Ukraine both at that time and earlier. They fought side by side with the Zaporozhian Cossacks in many battles, including the Battle of Berestechko. While the Zaporozhian Cossacks, in turn, participated in many events on the Don. For example, they took Azov. Historically, the Don is the center of the so-called Russian uprising, bordering Ukraine in the Donetsk region. And it is on this border that military operations are taking place today. That is why we decided to deal with the Don Cossacks and their ties to Ukraine, at least in general terms. If these arguments haven't convinced you yet, take a look at the flag of the Don Cossacks. Doesn't it remind you of anything? Yes, it does. So, let's start with 1570. When Moscow's Tsar Ivan the Terrible sent an envoy to the Don with a charter that today symbolizes the emergence of the Don Cossacks. In this charter, Tsar Ivan asked the Don Cossacks to help in every way possible in a diplomatic mission to the Ottomans, and in return promised various goodies. And we want to pay you for your service. This document is considered the starting point in the history of the Don host. However, those who have seen our video about the Zaporozhian host realize that the Don Cossacks lived on the Don long before Ivan the Terrible. Some researchers consider them descendants of the local peoples of the former Khazar Khaganate. Others say that all the locals were killed by the Mongols, and the Cossacks later moved in to take over. Yes, you understood correctly. The origin of the Don Cossacks is very similar to the history of the Zaporizhia Cossacks. The difference is that the Don settled in the Don River basin at a time when the Cossacks settled along the Dnipro and southern Bug. What is the difference between the Don and Ukrainian rivers? First of all, it flows not into the Black Sea, like ours, but into the Azov Sea. The Azov Sea is much smaller, and it enters the Black Sea through the narrow Kerch Strait. We have confirmed this very well after the story with the seizure of our boats by Muscovites. Whoever owns the Kerch Strait controls the Azov Sea. And in those days, the Kerch Strait was controlled by the Crimean Khanate and the Ottomans. That is, all the trade and military activity of the Don Cossacks rested in Turkey. In addition, in order to take control of the Don River, the Turks built the Azak fortress, which we call Azov, at its confluence with the Azov Sea. It should be noted here that the Don Delta is much smaller than the Dnipro Delta, so the Turks managed to seal off the river's exit and leave the Cossacks in maritime isolation. For this reason, the Don Cossacks, unlike the Zaporozhian Cossacks, did not have a strong fleet. A weak navy reduces the scope of military influence and restricts trade. That is why, compared to the Zaporozhian host, the Don host was smaller, poorer, and more dependent on its neighbors. And its neighbors were Circassians, Tatars, Kalmyks, Nogats, and the Zaporozhian Cossacks with whom the Don Cossacks border in the Donetsk region. We have already mentioned that the first capital of the Don Cossacks, Cherkask, now Staro-Cherkask, was founded by the Zaporozhian Cossacks. At the end of the 18th century, historian Afanasy Shapopov wrote that when the Turkish army marched to Astrakhan, Tsar Ioan Vasilyevich called Prince Mikhailo Vishnevetsky from the Dnipro with 5,000 Zaporizhia Cossacks, who built this city together with Donians, and lived there for a long time without wives, like the Zaporozhians. We made a separate video about life without a wife and the relationship between Cossacks and women in general, so we refer those who want to understand this issue to it. Now let's continue with the Donians. You probably noticed the name Vishnevetsky mentioned by the historian. Mikhailo Vishnevetsky was a senior member of the registered Cossacks, a second cousin of Dmytro Vishnevetsky, and the grandfather of Yerema Vishnevetsky, Khmelnytsky's main enemy. In 1570, he actually led an army to Astrakhan to help the Moscow Tsar get rid of the Turks and Crimeans. And the road to Astrakhan from us runs through the lands of the Donbass. So, as you can see, the Don Cossacks were formed under the great influence of the Zaporizhia Cossacks and were a kind of junior partner of our Cossack state. The neighbors often went on joint campaigns, including sea campaigns, when the Donbass managed to sneak past the Turkish fortress of Azov. It is interesting that the Donians called such maritime operations hunting for Zipans. Given that the Zipin is a type of warm outerwear, it becomes clear where the modern Russian tradition of traveling to Turkey for sheepskin coats and fur coats came from. However, the difficulty of access to the sea and the encirclement by Muslim countries led the Don Cossacks to quickly ally themselves with Christian Moscow, which was actively advancing south along its main transportation artery, the Volga, conquering Tatar lands. To begin with, the Donians swore allegiance to Ivan the Terrible's son Fyodor. However, Moscow's patronage was never sweet, and those times were no exception. Therefore, the Don Cossacks became active participants in the so-called troubled times in the history of Muscovy. In particular, they became allies of false Dmitry I and, together with Ukrainian registrars and Poles, put him on the throne in the Kremlin. Then the Donians supported the uprising led by Ivan Bolotnikov from Chernihiv. Together with his Cossacks, they besieged Moscow again. And after the defeat, they joined the army of false Dmitry II, known as the Tishino villain, and under the leadership of Petro Konashevich Sahedakny, put him on the throne, though not in the Kremlin, but in the village of Tishino, which temporarily became the alternative capital of the Tsardom. And we have not yet mentioned the many smaller wars and conflicts. However, after the first Romanov, Mikhail Fyodorovich, came to the throne of Moscow, the Don Cossacks swore allegiance to him and formed their own autonomy, the Don Host. The status of this autonomy is clearly evidenced by the fact that it communicated with Moscow through an ambassadorial order, an analogue of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. During the reform of Moscow Orthodoxy based on the Ukrainian model, which was carried out by Patriarch Nikon, the Don supported the Old Believers. That is, they again became opponents of the Tsar and even stopped honoring him and the Patriarch during church services. Then the Don Cossacks gathered under the banner of Stepan Razin, a native of the Ukrainian village of Zymoveska, and blocked the Volga trade route, raising one of the largest uprisings in Russian history, which some historians even tend to view as a war for the independence of the Astrakhan Khanate. Tsar Peter I, the grandson of Mikhail Romanov, began an active struggle with Turkey for the Azov Sea. And here he found full support from the Don autonomy, because the Azov fortress had long been a bone in the throat, or rather, at the mouth of the Don. The Don Cossacks fought as part of the Moscow army in the Azov campaigns of the future emperor and captured this hated Turkish fortress. However, they did not win much, because it soon became clear that the Moscow fortress of Korak was not much better for the Don Cossacks than the Turkish one. That is why, when 10 years later, the Slobozhen resident Kondrety Bulovin raised the uprising in Bakhmut, which we mentioned at the beginning, the Don Cossacks supported him and even chose him as their ataman. After the first defeat by the Tsarist army, Bulovin retreated to the Dnipro River and signed a secret union with the Zaporizhia host. The well-known Kodak fortress became his temporary camp. The Bulovin uprising angered Tsar Peter, and after it was suppressed, he eliminated the autonomy of the Don host. The Charter of Ivan the Terrible, which the Cossacks kept in the chancellery as evidence of their independence, was publicly destroyed, and administrative control was transferred to the Senate. The remnants of the rebels emigrated to the Crimean Khanate and settled in the Kuban, from where they later moved to the Danube, where they met the Zaporozhians again, but as rivals rather than allies. However, we have already talked about this meeting in a video about the Danube Sich, so please watch it if you haven't already. And those Don Cossacks who swore an oath to Peter the Great joined the Moscow army as an irregular unit. They retained some rights and privileges. But this is not the end of the story, because 70 years later, east of the Don, in the lands of the Volga and Ural Cossacks, an uprising began under the leadership of Yemelian Pugachev, a fellow villager of Stepan Razin from Stanitsia Zymovaiska, with a lesser Russian penchant for discontent. This uprising was the largest in Russian history. It covered the Orenburg region, the Urals, the Kama region, Bashkiria, part of western Siberia, and the middle and lower Volga regions. As we have already mentioned, Tatars, Bashkirs, Kazakhs, Chuvash, Mokshas, Urziane, and other peoples enslaved by Moscow fell under the hand of the Ukrainian Emperor Peter III, whose name was Pugachev. It was this war that became the decisive argument for Empress Catherine in her decision to destroy the Zaporozhian Sich and occupy the lands of the Zaporozhian host. She realized what the Cossack spirit leads to. The Don Cossacks were divided in their attitude to Pugachev. The commanders pursued the government line and tried to gather militia to help the government army, while ordinary Cossacks mostly remained neutral. Only a small number of people sided with the uprising. The government, in turn, decided to use the method of carrots and sticks. On the one hand, a lot of regular troops were sent to the Don, and on the other hand, rolls of bread were sent to compensate for the poor harvest year. And I must say that this method worked. The Don did not rise. That is why, after the suppression of the Pugachev uprising, the Don commanders were showered with a whole waterfall of Tsarist benefits. In particular, the Empress formed her own personal honorary Don Cossack Life Guards Brigade, which served as an honor guard. A separate military department was established on the Don to manage the Cossacks. Don Cossack commanders were equalized in rights to officers of the regular army, and generals were granted the right to nobility. Later, an administrative unit within the empire was formed, the Land, later the Don Host region, which was governed by separate rules. At the same time, the Muscovites destroyed the new Sich, occupied the Zaporizhia lands, and began to evict the Zaporozhian Cossacks. At this point, the paths of the Zaporizhia and Don Cossacks finally parted ways. The Zaporozhian Cossacks became an integral part of the Ukrainian nation and continued to fight for their own state. The Don Cossacks turned into an ideological pillar of the empire. The Don host region existed until the collapse of the Russian Empire. Don Cossacks fought in the Russian army and performed police functions. After the February Revolution of 1917, the Don host declared autonomy and later independence. However, part of its territory, the port of Taganrog and the surrounding lands, was joined to the Ukrainian state of Skoropadsky as a result of the Brest Peace Treaty with Soviet Russia. The Don and the Don Cossacks served as the mainstay of the monarchists, the so-called White Movement, which actively fought the Bolsheviks. It is therefore not surprising that after the communist victory, the Don Cossacks were mercilessly exterminated. There was even a separate policy of decossakization, just like our dekulakization. Therefore, in Soviet times, the unexterminated Don Cossacks were turned into a decoration that the Soviet government used to cover its cannibalistic policy. Actually, the same role is played today by the so-called Don Cossacks who are entering Ukraine and taking an active part in the hostilities in Donbass. All these papachas, leggings, lamps, halters and mustaches are nothing more than a cover for the FSB and GRU structures, which are trying to control the part of the local population that preserves the remnants of Cossack traditions. After all, let's not forget that one of the largest post-war uprisings against the Soviet government took place in 1962 in Novocherkassk, the former capital of the almighty Don host, an independent state that was formed after the collapse of the Russian Empire. However, hoping for the Russian uprising, as you can see from history, is the futile exercise. And it will take a long time to wait for an anti-Russian uprising, when suppressed peoples rise up to fight the Muscovites. Moscow is too strong now, and national movements are too weak and disunited. Therefore, you and I will have to fight against the Russian assault on our own, every day and every minute. After all, we, Ukrainians, have fortunately preserved the Cossack spirit, which Russian investigators call the propensity for discontent. We have never allowed and will never allow a long-term dictatorship to be established over us. And now that independence is not a dream, but a proven fact, our task is to build the state in all spheres, especially in the information sector. Therefore, do not hesitate to promote Ukrainian, support Ukrainian, and create Ukrainian. Watch our videos, recommend them to your friends, share them, and, of course, don't spare your likes, because everyone will be rewarded according to them.